Suppose the United States is willing to offer military and security assistance to Saudi Arabia. The condition is that Saudi Arabia establishes diplomatic relations with Israel. Of course, the larger goal is whether the United States is targeting China, demanding that Saudi Arabia maintains a certain distance from China in terms of economics, technology, and finance. Specifically, China should not be allowed to establish military bases in Saudi Arabia. Would the Saudi Crown Prince comply with these conditions? My answer is that he wouldn't. Why do I say that? U.S. President Biden is currently promoting a so-called Grand Reconciliation Plan in the Middle East. This plan involves Saudi Arabia and Israel establishing diplomatic relations while formalizing the two-state solution for Palestine and Israel. In return, the U.S. would provide Saudi Arabia with security guarantees. The White House has been dropping hints that the details of this series of diplomatic arrangements could be finalized within the next 9 to 12 months. And as we know, that timeframe coincides with the most tense period of the U.S. presidential elections. During the 2020 elections, Trump also made a move like this, resulting in the UAE and Israel establishing diplomatic ties. However, Saudi Arabia backed away from the brink of such relations back then, primarily due to the inability to facilitate the establishment of a Palestinian state. Now, the window of opportunity has reappeared. Regardless of whether it's a Republican or Democratic presidential candidate, they both want support from Jewish interest groups during the crucial time of the presidential election. From the Democratic perspective, they view the turmoil in the Middle East as being caused by the conflict between Palestine and Israel. Biden's demand that Saudi Arabia maintain a distance from China can also be seen as a counterattack against China's previous offensive moves. This move includes three main aspects. First, demanding that Saudi Arabia restrict the use of Huawei's technology. In reality, when Trump began suppressing Huawei during his tenure, it was somewhat of an advertisement for the company. So, Saudi Arabia and the UAE adopted Huawei's 5G technology and found it to be fast and efficient. Following that, Saudi Arabia utilized Huawei's technology in smart city projects and more. Why is the US so concerned about Huawei's development in the Middle East? Because once these Middle Eastern countries heavily utilize Huawei, the US loses the ability to monitor local situations through telecommunications, or in other words, it can't engage in surveillance using telecommunications equipment. The second point is demanding that Saudi Arabia ensure China doesn't establish military bases in the country. Regarding this, if the U.S. continues to maintain military bases in Saudi Arabia, China has no need to establish its own. If U.S. bases are withdrawn, why shouldn't China go? This brings us to the military cooperation between China and Saudi Arabia. In 1987, China exported medium-range Dongfeng missiles to Saudi Arabia. Indeed, these missiles played an important strategic role during the Gulf War. In recent years, China has successfully established a military drone production line with the UAE. A significant point to watch in the future is whether China's naval vessels will be sold to Gulf countries in the Middle East. The third and most crucial point of the U.S. demands on Saudi Arabia is that Saudi Arabia must ensure that when exporting oil to China in the future, transactions must be conducted in U.S. dollars, not Chinese yuan. This is quite difficult, as both China and Saudi Arabia are sovereign nations conducting trade outside the U.S. Why shouldn't they use the yuan for transactions? To understand this, we need to delve into history. During the 1973 Middle East War, Henry Kissinger conducted shuttle diplomacy. Aside from facilitating talks in the Middle East, another important goal was to ensure that Saudi Arabia exclusively used the US dollar for oil trade transactions. This gave rise to the concept of the petrodollar and ensured a continuous flow of Middle Eastern funds into the US dollar system. At that time, the Bretton Woods system had collapsed. The substantial influx of petrodollars from Saudi Arabia and the Middle East truly secured the continuing dominance of the US dollar. This agreement essentially saved the dollar. So, what benefits did Saudi Arabia gain from this? It gained control of Saudi Aramco. Everyone is curious about what Aramco means. It's short for Arab American. because Aramco was founded in 1933 by a group of American oil companies for oil exploration in Saudi Arabia. Thus, when signing the agreement in 1973 that stated oil transactions must be settled exclusively in US dollars, Saudi Arabia gradually negotiated for control of Aramco. By the late 1980s, after the second oil crisis in 1980, the US fully handed over control of Aramco to Saudi Arabia. At the same time, the company's headquarters returned to Saudi Arabia. Now, what's the current situation? China is Saudi Arabia's largest oil export market and will remain so in the future. The United States, due to shale oil, is no longer a feasible primary market. Additionally, China remains Saudi Arabia's largest import source. Economic ties between the US and Saudi Arabia, apart from military deals, have already dwindled and will continue to decrease. From this perspective, Saudi Arabia's future outlook is quite accurate. Of course, if you've been to the desert, you know that people and their growth there require extraordinary patience. It took Saudi Arabia a full 50 years to fully acquire control of Aramco. Therefore, when observing the relationship between China and Saudi Arabia, we must consider this dimension.